This content will be recorded and made available in an accessible alternative format upon request. Hi, my name is Sarah Bordeaux, and this is your tutorial for FAS 201 Milestone 1, due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. local time. This paper asks you to compare 3 works of art, 1 visual, 1 literary, and 1 contemporary work of your choice, according to a specific theme, using skills you will acquire in this course throughout the term. The final paper is not due until the end of the term, but its construction is broken down into 3 stages. This tutorial is designed to provide guidance in writing your introduction. Specifically, it addresses how to introduce each of your works in a clear and concise manner, and how to relate them thematically to a contemporary example. This latter point means that we will touch upon how to choose a contemporary work and how to write a thesis. Now, what is meant by contemporary? Whereas the modern period, generally speaking, encompasses the late 19th to mid-20th centuries, and postmodern describes certain mid to late 20th century art, the word contemporary, for the purpose of this assignment, refers to work created in the last few years. Think post-2000. The more recent your contemporary example, the more relevant it will be to this assignment. As we move through this tutorial, I will refer to the FAS 201 Milestone 1 Guidelines and Rubric. I recommend having a copy handy as a reference. You can find it within your Blackboard shell by going to Assignment Rubrics in blue at the upper left and clicking on Milestone 1 Guidelines and Rubric. Something I recommend when you're reading through the instructions is to focus on the key elements of the overview. This paper is basically asking you to utilize skills that you've already demonstrated in this course. That is, showing how works of art share a common theme, which you did in Module 1 on the discussion board, and relating conventions in ancient art to the norms of today's world, something you practiced in the discussion board of Module 2. Note that on page 1 of the Milestone 1 Guidelines and Rubric, you will find a list of suggested comparisons or pairs of art and accompanying themes from which to select your core comparison. This tutorial assumes that you will choose your initial pair from among these pieces. You must obtain approval from your instructor if you are interested in choosing works or a theme not on this list. In just a moment, I am going to model how to write an introduction based on the prompts you will find in MINDEDGE Module 3.37. You can click to it up here. Submission Milestone 1, where you should go to prepare your assignment for submission. Whoops. It would be useful for you to locate this page in MINDEDGE so that you can follow along as I read. Note that if you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you will find instructions for downloading this draft as a Word document, visiting Submit Your Assignments in Blackboard, and uploading your paper. The works I am using are not on the list of comparisons and are off limits to you for use in your paper now that I am employing them in this example. I want to point out that even though your instructions do not specifically ask you to do so, I am incorporating mention of my contemporary example into my introduction. It is best practice to be thinking ahead about how you want your entire paper to come together. If you have questions about this, you should ask your instructor about their expectations. So beginning with the initial prompt at the top of the MINDEDGE page. It reads, in the text box below, briefly identify the works of art you've selected for Milestone 1. State the theme and time period associated with these works of art. The artworks I have selected, both of which were created in ancient Greece, are the vase painting, The Suicide of Ajax by Exekias, and the play Antigone by Sophocles. One theme these works have in common is that of the noble or honorable death. And you can see on the screen I'm showing you on the left the vase that I've just mentioned. On the right, I'm just showing you a brief excerpt from the play. The idea is I will get into more quotes and more detail about the play as I venture further into the body of my paper in future milestones. So the second prompt reads, in the text box below, write 1 to 2 sentences that introduce each work of art. For each work, be sure to identify the title, the author or artist, the date or period the artwork was created, and the cultural location or physical setting of the piece. So note that you've already introduced some of this information, and here you'll simply add what's left. Some of these prompts kind of flow into one another, so it's not asking you to repeat information. The archaic Greek vase by painter and potter Exekias dates from around 540 BCE and is currently located in the Chateau Musée in Boulogne-sur-Mer, France. Sophocles' classical Greek tragedy was written about 100 years later, circa 441 BCE. The story takes place in Thebes. The next prompt reads, in the text box below, write 2 to 3 sentences that compare the themes and meanings of the artworks. Exekias depicts an episode from the Trojan War following the death of Achilles, whose best friend Ajax denied Achilles armor and, recovering from a consequent raging fit of despair, prepares to fall on his own sword to salvage his honor. In Antigone, the title character places an act of family duty above the law and is condemned to a slow death. She welcomes her punishment as a mark of honor, but takes fate into her own hands by hanging herself. And I just want to point out here that this prompt is a little tricky because what it's asking you to do is very, very briefly give some idea of the meaning of these works or the plot, the gist of them, which is really difficult to do in just a sentence or two, especially when you're trying to keep in mind that you are also attempting to stay on topic in accordance with the theme that you've selected and cater to what's significant about each of these artworks. So in writing my introduction, I spent the most time on this particular prompt. Okay, so moving on to the next prompt. In the text box below, write 2 to 3 sentences that connect the artworks you've selected to the theme you identified in question 1. In doing so, you will introduce the argument you develop in the remainder of your essay. So this prompt is important in that it's asking you to develop your thesis in part. That will be the last sentence or so of your paragraph. And something that I decided to do with my paragraph, since I had really already sort of done what it was asking, the first part of what it was asking, is I decided to introduce my third work of art, my contemporary piece. So, the first part of the end of my introductory paragraph reads, "In contemporary culture, we may locate the theme of the noble or honorable death in that of Ned Stark from Season 1, Episode 9 of the HBO television series Game of Thrones. Stark refuses to swear loyalty to a false heir to the throne and is executed." Now that's all I say about it right here, but it's important, I think, that the work is introduced so that it's not just randomly coming up later in your paper. Which brings us to my thesis. My thesis reads, "This theme draws together 3 creative works from different media that illustrate the concept of dying for one's principles, a popular theme in ancient Greek tragedies, and one that still resonates with fans of modern narratives. Now, this is something that I'm going to flesh out in the body of my paper. So it's something that I've hinted at, particularly with my 2 initial works, but I haven't had time in my introductory paragraph to elaborate fully by any means. So you're kind of towing a fine line there. Your introductory paragraph is just a paragraph. So you want to introduce, but at the same time, you're not writing an entire paper in your first paragraph. What you do want to have accomplished is you want to have given the identifying information for at least your initial pair of works. I chose also to mention my contemporary parallel. I identified my theme, and I explained how my Greek works related to this theme. I also mentioned how the third work related to the theme a bit later in the paragraph. And I established my thesis, the last sentence of my introductory paragraph, which I will develop in the body of my paper. Now, as far as my contemporary expression, or the third work, goes, my main advice I would give for picking a contemporary example that applies to your theme is that this is your chance to incorporate something relevant to you that you are enthusiastic about into your paper. In this case, I chose Game of Thrones because I happen to be a Game of Thrones fan, but also because it applies to this theme, which is something that I know I will be able to articulate later on in the paper. So, 2 things. Think about being creative and, having fun with this aspect of the assignment, but also think ahead. So it needs to be relevant. You need to be planful, in other words. So even though this is just the introduction, you need to be prepared for what's to come and how these choices that you're making now are going to fit into the rest of your paper. But that is all for today. So I will see you next time. Bye-bye.